We said we were going to wait till this game was over, and now it's in overtime, and we just want to talk football and get going with y'all. So that's what we're doing. Alabama's got the ball, about to be 2nd and 7 in the first round of overtime, and we're just here to talk ball with y'all. Josh, I think a lot of people are talking about the decision for Alabama to chase points early with 2 consecutive 2-point conversion attempts. And the second one was the one that really bothered me because if they converted the 2-point conversion, they go up by 6, which means you're hoping a missed extra point if they do the return touchdown keeps you tied. But for me, I'm thinking, no, if they get the return touchdown, they're probably going to have to go for 2 themselves to not make it a 2-point game. So that was interesting to me. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it was weird. The first time they didn't go for the extra point, they just went for 2. I think I kind of got it. I was trying to play out of my head all the different ways it would work, and it was trying to make it such that a field goal would tie the game. All right, I get it, right? But the second time, to your point, I was really struggling to figure out where the advantage would be, and I'm sure somebody in the comments is going to tell me how it works out. But the current scenario seemed a lot more likely than anything else, right? That LSU would get 1 score, and then Alabama would be kicking a field goal following that. Didn't seem like there was much of a chance for it to be a 2-score game, 2 scores on a given side, which is the only way the 2-point conversion was going to matter. Weird. I don't know who made that decision or what chart said it, but it didn't, with the time and the score, it did not make any sense to me.
It almost feels like with analytics, modern analytics, I know there's the sheet and you get into a certain quadrant, but also to me, it feels like if there's an odd number score, if it's not lining with 3s or 7s, people go for 2. And I feel like that's kind of the cadence that a lot of teams get into.
Yeah. I tend to agree with it. I don't know. It's just weird. Like the whole way this game in particular is gone is strange. And again, we're kind of distracted because we're watching how this one ends. But I think the thing that is really most striking about it is it's really obvious that Bryce Young is off for whatever variety of reasons. The commentators have been very nice for the fact that Bryce Young's been really bad for a lot of this game. He's missed, I think probably about 1/3 of his throws have been uncatchable, which is really egregious to any offense, right? Because a good completion percentage is about, 65%. If your base number is like 60%, if you catch everything that can be caught, you're going to have a really bad day. And that's where Alabama has been from a passing game perspective. It's actually kind of amazing, really, that this game is as close as it is, all things considered. Alabama's defense eventually wore down, but I mean, they really held their own quietly for a lot of this game until the end, where they just kind of caved in, I think. Though I think it's also really hard to stop LSU in 4 down. I will say that too. Jaden Daniels' ability to extend plays, a lot like what's happening probably right now with Bryce Young for LSU. It's very, very hard to stop a quarterback that can run the football if they get 4 downs to do it, because there's so many ways for them to get like 6 yards.
Josh, I want to add, it's interesting to me that like we get the feeling in all of these scenarios, because now I'm like not on the Bob train or the Pete Golding train. Tonight it felt like, yes, Alabama defense played good early, and then every time Alabama got a score, it'd take 3 plays and LSU was right there kicking a field goal or going for a touchdown. And it's just like, it feels like every time Alabama needs their defense to step up, they don't. And I think we saw this last year in the Texas A&M game. It's just a common thread. And to me, it's one of those situations where Alabama statistically, offensively and defensively, rank highly. So it's like, fire the guy that's got the 6th best defense or the 3rd best offense in the country. And to me, it feels like those numbers are just a little bit misleading. And at some point, the play on the field is just not measuring up with the number of athletes, 5-star talent that they have on this team.
Yeah, I agree with that. But on the other hand, and LSU has their own 5-star talent. I think a lot of the reactions to this game really are stemming from people that underestimated LSU to a certain degree. I didn't know necessarily if this game would be too close. You can go back and forth a lot on that. And I know somebody in the comments, made a comment when we were talking earlier that really it's just LSU that's stepped up. But Alabama's off offensively. They're not really playing well. We saw the same thing from Clemson today against Notre Dame. We'll probably talk about that later when I'm more confident that everybody's going to be on, because usually what happens, and I think we're seeing it right now, is our numbers will jump by about 3 times when the game ends. That's why we don't like to start while these games are going on. The LSU's defense is playing a lot better. They're playing better football. They've really learned how to use their pass rushers. Harold Perkins has been obviously a huge factor for them in that. Ojulari's been big. Wingo has probably been better than Mason, who got hurt earlier in the year, and I thought that was going to be a huge blow for them. And so between Gay and Ojulari and Perkins, they've kind of gotten this large cadre of guys that can disrupt. And their secondary, which was full of transfers, has really gelled, and so they've gotten a lot better. The problem is in Alabama, like you said, has a ton of 5-stars. They should be better than this. And right now they can't really make a play. So I think it's a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. And given how many drives they had early in the game, it's kind of surprising that Alabama didn't move the ball better if you were looking at this from a pregame perspective. But the reality of it is just they're not executing at all. And I don't know. They've had some definite off games, but they had a couple when Bryce Young wasn't there. They had about a quarter and a half versus Texas. It was pretty bad. In many ways, this has been worse than that Texas game from an execution standpoint. Maybe not from a penalty standpoint. I don't know where the numbers are right now, but from an execution standpoint, it's been pretty horrendous for Alabama offensively. And I don't know. It wouldn't have taken, all they had to do was get like 30 points on the board, right? And they probably almost certainly win this game. So it's kind of odd.
In the early points would have put a different kind of pressure on LSU, and they probably don't get 24. But really, to me, this goes back to last year too. They would go to sleep for multiple quarters. They had 0 points on the board, I think, or maybe 3 heading into the fourth quarter against a pretty terrible Auburn team last year, a mediocre Auburn team last year. This is inexcusable to me for a team that's got this much talent, because it's not just that they're not winning or they're not scoring a bunch of points. It's that they're offensively performing so poorly that it's putting the defense. One of the touchdowns they gave up tonight was because it was like 3 and out, and not only 3 and out, I think they had 4 possessions in a row combined. They had -2 yards. That To me, you can't excuse that with this level of talent. Even if Bryce Young is off, like, you see far less talent out there that can scheme together a first down or 2 to get some rhythm going, or at least get your football outside of your own goalpost. And that's just what we don't see for huge stretches against what is usually inferior opponents. I do agree that this is a good LSU team in terms of talent, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I agree with that. I think we've missed a super chat a minute ago. I know one of them was talking
Stephen
about how
Light.
Alabama's receiving. Stephen Light right now. So let's cover his. Thanks. Stephen Light says, best Saturday roundup. Thanks again for the stream. We appreciate it, Stephen. Stephen's been hugely supportive of us in every way possible for as long as I can remember. And that's tremendously appreciated. It's Killtack9, who's another guy I feel like he gives us a super chat about every time we do this, which is, I think, over the top generous. But he made the comment that Bama's biggest problem today is catching the ball and not knowing how to tackle or how tackling works. But I think that goes to sort of to Daniel's point. Their ability to catch has been poor, and they've dropped a couple. There have been way more that were almost uncatchable or uncatchable than there were dropped. It from a quarterback perspective, like if you were to grade the QB play, I think Jaden Daniels has had a solid A-, B+ game. There are a lot of other pieces around him that haven't been great. Alabama has maybe a little more pass rush. I really think Bryce Young's like a C- game from the quarterback position.
I do too.
Like this has been poor. So it's
and somebody complained, welcome to the Alabama postgame show, but look, this is like the biggest story in college football. So we'll talk about other stuff, certainly, but this game is ongoing. If this was Ohio State and Northwestern in overtime or whatever, we'll be talking about that.
Yeah, if this was Ohio State, or this would be, it's not really even Ohio State Northwestern, right? It'd be like maybe Ohio State Illinois. I'm trying to think of the equivalent.
Well, I'm just saying
It's
if
not quite Ohio State, Michigan.
no,
but
it wasn't a shot. I was just saying if that earlier game where it was looking for 2.5 quarters that Ohio State might end up in an overtime type game, like if that was tonight, if I don't care who the opponent was, really, it's just that like, man, this is news, right? Like this is relevant.
Yeah, well, I mean, we made the decision. We talked about that for the past few weeks to try to not start these until after the game's ended,
Right.
because
We're a
again,
little distracted.
there's 255 people watching, and we always watch these games that run late. And the other problem is if we started right now doing our actual reviews and recaps, everyone that joins after this game ends is going to ask about all those games that we have already covered. And we got kind of sick of dealing with that. So we just sort of embraced the fact that we were probably going to talk about the game. Oh my gosh, Jaden Daniels just, man, that guy is just on fire.
One play. Wow.
One play. One play, man. As I said, I mean, so maybe you could bump that A- grade to an A grade. I mean, he's been,
and I think he's great. Like I think he's improved throughout the year, but also this is another thing that's interesting to me. I'm talking about this Alabama defense. Alabama's offense grinds and grinds and grinds and grinds and gets a score, and then 2 plays later, it's been down the field. Right. This one takes 1 play in overtime. To me, it just feels like they're missing something, and I don't know what it is. And you know,
wait,
on paper,
LSU's going to go for 2 in the win. This is interesting.
They might be trying to force a false start.
No, they called the timeout. I think I see the strategy here. So now he's yelling at somebody, so I'm not sure. Not sure what the deal is. So one strategy, I think you get 1 timeout per rotation. Is that right? Per overtime rotation. So you can always line up for 2 if you have a 2-point play that works against a given look, right? And if you don't like it, just call the timeout and switch back to your XP unit, kick the extra point. There's no harm in that unless you just have no willingness to ever run the 2-point play, because you don't get any special credit for keeping your timeout between series. So anytime you're the second one to score, I never really thought about that before. If you have any interest ever in running a 2-point conversion, if you're ever the second one to score, you should probably always just
see the alignment,
play, see the alignment, and then call the timeout if you don't want to do it. Though it looks like they're probably, they're right now huddling. Looks like they're going to line up. And
I think it's smart to try also to force an offside free play, or get, if you get an offside contact, then you have it at the 1.5 yard line, because kicking an extra point, if you're kicking it from there or 5 yards back in case you go offsides, like it's really no different. So I can totally see, especially there's so many advantages in going second, right? Like just so many advantages.
Yeah, let me touch on a couple super chats here. Josh Nador said, reminder to like the video. Go Dogs. Man, it's pretty wild when people are super chatting us to remind other people to like the video. I really appreciate that, Josh. And then Quasar0121 said, Alabama's not the win we thought it was. UGA's that bad, or a bit of both. And I assume he is a Tennessee fan based on that comment. And he scored. Game over. Sorry for anybody if I ruined it, but yeah, LSU scores on the 2-point play, and it's just a little swing route, rub route. I wasn't quite sure from the tight end. He takes the flat, and they were just pretty sure that guy was going to out leverage him, and he did it. So LSU wins, takes control of the West. They've already beaten the Ole Miss, and even though they're a 2-loss team, remember they only have 1 loss in the SEC, so that other loss doesn't matter for divisional standings. LSU will have to lose to Arkansas more than likely. I'm trying to remember who they've left in their schedule. Arkansas and A&M, right? I think that's right. So they're going to have to lose one of those 2 games to not win the division. So yeah, I mean, you're looking at probably LSU and Georgia as your 2 SEC championship game participants there. Pretty wild result. Gutsy call to go for 2 at the end of the game, and they pull it off, man. That's something else.
Yeah, I think that, I will also say this, like for Alabama fans that are that are on here at all, maybe there's not many that might watch this tomorrow that are maybe a little crushed. I think this is one, you get this closure now, and you can kind of maybe enjoy the rest of the season. I don't know, without worrying about it because you're not going to win the division. Alabama might lose to Ole Miss. I think I'm the one who tweeted Alabama's mid. I kind of believe it. I don't think LSU is a great football team. But then again, I don't think Texas is a great football team. I think Tennessee is a great football offense, but to me, there is something off with this Alabama team. Staff and Nick Saban, I think, is 71 years old. He's probably got one more quote unquote rebuild in him, but I think he needs probably something like this to confirm that he needs to go in a new direction. He needs to go in a new direction offensively and defensively, in my opinion. And I will say this too, for all the people that are like, he wasted Bryce Young's 2 years. I'm just not sold that Bryce Young is. I might get killed for this. I might get crow for this. I'm not sold that he's an elite quarterback. Maybe it's his shoulder this year, but remember last year he had the same issues on the road. He couldn't scrape together more than 10 points in regulation against Auburn. Remember, they almost lost to LSU last year, and they had this whole thing where they burned a couple of quarters with a bunch of 3 and outs. At some point, like if you just look at how much it is a struggle in this offense to get yards, and that's probably scheme too, compared to a Tua or a Mac Jones, or even going back to like an AJ McCarron with a pretty poor offensive coordinator. This struggle is painful to watch if you're an Alabama fan, knowing how much talent they have. And I don't know that this maybe being the end of the Bryce Young era and not getting a national championship out of him is the end of the world. I don't know that they'd take a huge step backwards with another quarterback. What do you think, Josh?
Yeah, no, I tend to agree with it. I don't know. I mean, I really do think about 2/3 of the way through the end of last year, and we talked about it a lot. People kind of figured out Bryce Young. Like, dude's short. They have him listed at like 5'11". I think he may be more like 5'9". And when teams get pressure up the middle, and Herb Street talked about it a little bit in that game earlier, he struggles. And I don't think he can see over the line of scrimmage. And because of that, they can't attack the middle of the field, even when teams are bringing heavy interior blitz. So teams now just sort of learn they can blitz with abandon. And sometimes Alabama burns you with like one of those little Texas routes. That was the long, who was it? Gibbs in that game had a long run or catch and run off it. But by and large, they don't really attack the middle of the field. It's kind of interesting. And I think the one thing I will say is that Bryce Young typically is a very accurate, consistent quarterback in terms of throwing the football, and he was all over the place in this game. So I do think the shoulder injury is a huge, huge deal, and probably a major contributing factor for why they lost. But I also want to take a second and talk a little bit about why they won. I'm watching the replay right now of the 2-point conversion. Sure enough, they had something that they knew they could get. They motioned the tight end back and forth, and they had a stack. When they motioned the tight end, they knew the safety rolls down to get the tight end, and there's no way the safety can roll down to get that tight end and prevent him from going in the flat and having leverage for about a 3-yard completion, which is what they got. The only way Alabama was going to be able to stop that from that formation was zone, and they were in man. So that's my thing on Bryce Young. But let's turn it around a little bit and talk a little bit about LSU, because I think the underappreciated part of this whole conversation is how well LSU panned out. I mean, they had a bad start to the season with that loss to Florida State, which we talked about and covered. It was a game where Jaden Daniels played pretty darn poorly. They dropped everything in sight. The defense was out of sync. Again, this is a team that had I forget the numbers, 26 players that transferred in and out of the program, 32 freshmen on that team. A lot of guys that are contributing now and weren't contributing at the time. But you look at the rest of the season, and really, the one mar there is the Tennessee game where they got blown out 40-13. But as we've talked about several times, they lose the left tackle to illness, which is Will Campbell, and then they lose the left guard, Dellinger, to – sorry, guys, I'm actually kind of sick today, apparently. They lose the left guard to injury in the first or beginning of the second quarter, and it just absolutely cratered the offense, and it just over time that snowballed. Otherwise, blowing out Mississippi State's a pretty good deal. They beat Auburn narrowly, which that game offensively was an absolute disaster for LSU. But then after that, against Florida, now Ole Miss, and now Alabama, they look like a far more complete team. Offensively, they're really competent. Jaden Daniels right now, today, is a better quarterback than Bryce Young. I'm going to say that. I think right now.
I think so too.
I don't know if right now, like, he probably had one of the best days of any QB. And I know we were messaging back and forth earlier on various games, and I noted, that, Jaden Daniels was, maybe had the best day of any quarterback in the country, really. And, this is a good football team. And I think a lot of people are going to laugh. And if somebody, again, try to cover a couple super chats here because they're stacking up a little bit. Dante Whitaker said, I think Saban threw this game on purpose because he knows they have no shot against Georgia. I think the mistake here is thinking that LSU has no shot against Georgia. I think LSU is a good football team, and they are a little bit limited at times offensively. But when they get the production they got today out of Daniels, they can move the ball well. Their defense is quite capable. That they're a pretty good football team. Daniel, do you have the super chat list in front of you, or do you want me to run through it?
I do not. I want to make one comment before we get too crazy on Jaden Daniels. He threw for 5.7 yards per attempt today. I think the big thing for he ran it for 95 yards, but 5.3. He had a couple of very impactful, timely runs. But I think the bigger thing for me, if we go back to what I was talking about earlier, is, and you messaged me this, at one point in the game, Alabama had 4 possessions in the red zone and 9 points, and LSU had 2 possessions in the red zone and had 14 points. And I think that was the difference in this game, was how Jaden Daniels played on that side of the field, how LSU's offense played, or how poorly Alabama's defense played, maybe sure the two, where LSU converted when they needed to in the red zone. And Alabama, this is how you modern offenses is you force them to kick field goal. Alabama had 9 points. 9 or 6 points at the half. That is a recipe for disaster. They held LSU to 7.5 points and still lost the game. So what's interesting to me too, Josh, but I want you to talk on this a little bit. Alabama had one wide receiver that had yards today. Ja'Cory Brooks, he had 97 yards. The backs fought for 74 and 64, which one running back, either of the running backs combined for more yards than all other wide receivers combined. I just think that there's something broken either in this personnel or in this scheme. You can go ahead and get some super chats, or we can kind of do this as a review and package this up, and it's up to you.
Well, we should wait a second. As everyone noted, your audio is actually cutting out quite a bit. On your mic,
is it?
So you probably want to fix that before we do. I don't know, and I feel like we've already kind of mostly reviewed it, but I'll talk on it in a minute. Yeah, I mean, if you look at where all the production came for Alabama, Jahmyr Gibbs had 8 receptions, McClellan had 2 receptions, Ja'Cory Brooks led all the receivers, and they had 97 yards receiving. The next best is their tight end had 50 yards, and the rest of the team contributed less than 40 yards receiving, I think. I mean, it's just nothing. And from LSU, I mean, it really wasn't great production either. They had 182 yards receiving to Alabama's 328. It's notable that Alabama, I mean, they had to outgain them. Yeah, they outgained LSU by about 100 yards, had more first downs, about the same third down efficiency, fourth down conversion percentage, better yards per attempt, slightly lower yards per carry. But again, that was sort of Daniels. The problem with Alabama is they have no explosiveness whatsoever. Outside the running game, if they have a couple big runs, they don't get any explosiveness. I think there's a personnel issue, but again, I think there's a quarterback issue. I don't know that they can throw the ball down the field. And there was a certain point in this game where I basically concluded that Bryce Young maybe can barely throw the ball over 10 or 15 yards with any real authority, or at least he's not pulling the trigger. I am very suspicious that Young, he may have a sprained AC joint. He might well have some sort of torn labrum or something that he's powering through, which you can do. His accuracy is all over the place. But I mean, the short version of it is it really comes down to the explosiveness factor. I mean, Alabama had that one long catch and run reception. And I said earlier it was Gibbs, but it's actually McClellan at 65 yards. Otherwise, nobody. So no one on the LSU side had any play of longer than 31 yards, and Alabama had one of a long 41 from Ja'Cory Brooks and a long 65 from McClellan. And I don't know that they had a pass over 25 yards the rest of the game. One decently long run of 34 yards. It's just hard. We talk about this all the time. It is really, really hard to win a football game when you have no explosiveness. That was true for both teams. The difference is at the end of the game, LSU got some explosive plays. And in the red zone, I really think it's the fact that Daniels was pretty accurate and consistent, whereas Alabama was just struggling to do basic things. That interception on the first drive of the game, as much as it was a wonder play to try to like get around a guy and throw the ball on that middle, some sort of middle slant, Bryce Young just missed. I mean, he threw the ball 3 yards behind the receiver and hit a DB that was beat in the chest. So, I mean, that really, quite frankly, that was the game in a nutshell, because that was all night for Alabama. All those drives where they were stalling in the first and second quarter, every one of those drives, I'm pretty sure, had at least one pass from Bryce Young that was not within the catch radius of a receiver. And yeah, they did have some drops and things, but that you cannot have uncatchable balls thrown. It's the DJU problem. It's why he's been bad at Clemson. And I want to transition to that one in just a minute, because I feel like we've talked on this one long enough. But Alabama frankly, what Alabama looks like is they look like Clemson offensively, a better version of it, but there's no explosiveness. The passing game today was very erratic. They ran the ball okay, but not nearly well enough to move the stick. So when you put all that stuff together, I mean, you get a plodding result. You can't have 10 to 15-yard play drives that consistently score touchdowns, and it's very hard to score in the red zone if you got a quarterback that's inaccurate, because unless your run game is dominant, red zone scoring is all about quarterback accuracy and efficiency of running the offense, and it just wasn't there.
So I'm going to talk a little bit. Y'all let me know if my audio is bad. Josh, does it sound okay to you?
You sound better now.
Okay. If it gets bad again, just interrupt me and I'll go log off for the night and I'll go to bed early. Yeah, Clemson is interesting because those Clemson fans got at me last week when I said, look, I'm not that impressed with Wake Forest anymore. That was an overtime win. I'm not impressed with NC State, even when they had Devin Leary. They weren't good offensively. That was a bad team. People trying to make Syracuse good is like Mean Girls trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen. I just to me, it's DJU is part of the problem. I think they have a scheme issue like Alabama. But at what point do you?
I'll say the past couple times they put Klubnik in and they put him in for part of this game, he hasn't looked any better. The last two times I've seen him, they put him in and he had a spark a few games ago, and I'm just struggling
from running the ball.
The game was, but it was all running. Throwing it, he wasn't any better than DJU. I think a lot of it must be a scheme issue, but partly I Klubnik looks like a freshman, is a big part of it. So they did put him into that game. I'm trying to pull up a stat line now to say exactly how that shook out. I mean, yeah, he threw one incomplete pass, and that was it. It just, I don't know. I mean, the biggest thing is that, and I saw him in, I wasn't sure how much he played, but the biggest thing is when he was in a few games ago, it didn't really pan out. Let me, I'm going to cover 2 super chats for the Alabama game so we can get off it. Maybe talk about the Notre Dame game a bit and then get to the others in turn. Guthrie Leith said, Alabama can't put together 60 minutes of clean, consistent football. We're incredibly talented, but we won't win a national championship this year. Love you guys. How about Iowa scoring offensive touchdowns today? And I think that in a nutshell is kind of like the best way to respond to college football, because it's always sort of a weird, crazy thing. But yeah, I mean, the truth of the matter, and this is trying to segue a little bit into the Clemson game, nobody seems to be able to put together 60 minutes of football. I mean, I don't know if you watched Ohio State at the beginning of today. They didn't look good. Michigan didn't look great at all for about a half. Clemson has been more down than up, but they've looked pretty good at times. LSU team that just won got blown out. Tennessee that blew out Alabama they didn't really get blown out, which is weird. And we'll talk about that in a bit, what that does or doesn't mean, but beaten pretty soundly. And the team that beat them soundly was a team everybody was making fun of because they nearly lost to Missouri and struggled to put away Kent State. So
Right.
if you want to play the game of our team doesn't look consistent, you're just going to have the Spider-Man meme with like 7 different people pointing at each other. And I think that's, frankly, I've said it several times this year. I think defenses have caught up to offenses to a large degree, and they figured out some of those RPO concepts and how to play it. And we're kind of getting back to the reality of what football usually is, where it's a spotty sport, where teams sometimes have on days and off days offensively, and some teams are on and off defensively, and it's more emotionally driven. We've been used to this world where more talented teams can score billions of points and win on a really consistent basis. There's a super chat that I'm just confused at, and I'm just going to ignore it, and you guys will probably figure out what that is. And then the other thing, somebody said, Daniel, that's a bad take on Young. I don't know, maybe that he's not an elite quarterback, but that's the other side of it, right? Like CJ Stroud did not look great today for most all that game. And when you talk about DJU and Klubnik and all these guys, none of them looking elite on a consistent basis. Will Levis looked like crap, frankly. And I know he's banged up, but yeah, he's dealing with some lower body injuries. But Bryce Young probably has an injured shoulder, and we don't know how bad. I don't know how you evaluate any of them, and you're going to have the same problem when you talk about evaluating QBs as you're going to have when we do our top 10. Look, if you want somebody that's clearly a first-round draft pick quarterback, you're not going to find it in terms of a spotless resume. None of these guys have been perfect every game. None of these guys have been completely incredibly consistent. But again, I think it's just because defenses are catching up. And in the same way that the perfect quarterback prospects usually don't turn out in the pros, those same warts crop up in college. And ironically, the pros are probably going to have an easier job evaluating in some ways because they're going to see how these guys handle adversity. Whereas before, they were just throwing the wide open guys on 40-yard go routes over and over again for touchdowns. So it's a little more realistic.
And Josh, people are coming in here, and I think it's a fair point about the 30-mile-an-hour winds today, but this is not the first day that he struggled. And if we want to, we can't blame weather for the first half of the Iowa game. We can't blame, like, there's times
Notre Dame, Iowa, Penn State, and now this game. We've had apps where nothing worked and he wasn't in rhythm and he missed throws. Like, it's too many.
It's a thing.
Too many plays.
And look, we're also, like, I literally just said that I am now down on a Heisman winning quarterback. So it's not like we're just trashing Big Ten guys or whatever. I think the overall quarterback play in college football is down, and Big Ten used to be a quarterback league. And who's the second best quarterback in the Big Ten right now? Talia had like 66 yards through 3 quarters today. And I just, at some point, we have to admit that, one, defenses have caught up, might be a little bit of a COVID hangover. And two, the overall play just isn't there. Josh, you talk about how we've kind of come back to what college football used to be in terms of parity and things like that. How much of it is that, there are great equalizers now that used to not exist in terms of the democratization of scheme, especially starting at the high school level. So you can have good scheme offensively and defensively. There's no secrets anymore. Facilities, strength and conditioning programs, nutrition programs, how to run a program. All these things are no longer something that's special to the elites, and like everybody can have it now because that information is out there. How much of that do you think is playing a role, or is it really just kind of a weird stage right now, and we'll get back to not having parity at the top here soon?
I think it's all sort of playing a role. It's all a factor in the game to some degree. And I think it is a down year on a lot of ways. Somebody was saying that, CJ Stroud had a 90% completion percentage in the first half against Penn State. And that may be true. My recollections are really a little weird on that. But I think the reality is the receiver. It's been really clear in college football that elite receiver play is the thing that breaks you open into turning into an elite offense. And Ohio State has probably the best receivers in college football. I think we all generally agree with that point. But the other side of that coin is that while they may have the best receivers in college football, they're still not Olave, Garrett Wilson, and Smith and Jigba. Like you can say Ibuka's really good. I think he's really good. I don't think he's as good as any of those three. You can say Harrison Jr. is very, very good. And I know you say he's the best receiver in college football. I'm sort of on the fence with that. I think he's really, really good. I don't know that he has the burst speed that Olave or Wilson had. And I think he's going to be a tremendous pro. But he's really, if he were a complimentary receiver, he'd be phenomenal. But when he's the guy that you need to burn somebody over the top, I don't know that he's got the burst. I don't know, Olave's running, 42-40 kind of speed over the top. And it's the same thing that Tennessee used with Hyatt. And I just don't know that the weapons are there. A few years ago, I mean, we had this series where, right, 2019, you had LSU with Jamar Chase and Jefferson. On the other side, you had Alabama with 4 first-round draft pick receivers, and Ohio State was playing with their first-round draft pick receivers, 3 or 4 of them on their side. Like, it was insane, the talent in the wide receiver position. I don't think it's nearly that good this year. Like, I do think Ohio State's really good. I think Tennessee's receivers are quite good, but they're just not what they were before.
Let's talk a little bit about, speaking of teams without elite wide receivers, one being Georgia. That game today, you said it was a little weird because it felt like a blowout, but the score wasn't a blowout, and Tennessee had missed opportunities in the red zone. But I think that game played out, ironically, a lot like the Kent State game, where Georgia had game control the whole way through. And even though it didn't look like a blowout, in terms of how they controlled the game, it really was one.
Yeah. It was kind of weird because that game ended 27-13. And there's this point where Tennessee looked like they might drive down and score and make it like a 1-touchdown game or something in the end of it. And I was sort of sitting there kind of shaking my head because it did not feel like the game was really remotely that close. And it was. I mean, just categorically, it was a 2-score game. But from a game control dominance perspective, I haven't seen an advanced box score, but I imagine it's pretty darn lopsided. I think the reality is that Georgia, top to bottom, they are as talented or more talented than anyone in the country. They've recruited at an insanely elite level. I'm watching Mississippi State. Mississippi State, in a tie game with like 40 seconds left, kicked an onside kick where they just drilled one of the up men in the chest. I guess that's the best way to do an onside kick now. Worked perfectly, got the ball back, and then they failed to get like 10 yards. And they just kicked a field goal that landed 10 yards short. So now that game's going to overtime. Seems to be the most interesting one on/left. But yeah, it's tough. And I know some people were in there. I see people in the chat commenting about, Marvin Harrison Jr. is great. What am I saying? Everybody's great. My receivers are great. I'm not saying you don't have a good receiving core. I'm saying if you look at Tennessee, if you look at, look at Ohio State this year, look at Alabama this year, look at all these teams. I just don't see the guys that were there a couple years ago. There was a reason why Smith and Jigba was the number 3 receiver at Ohio State when he was there. And yeah, I know he went off against Utah. Now that was a Utah team with a backup running back converted at corner, kind of a weird situation.
Yeah.
And I know Smith and Jigba has been hurt, so we can't really properly evaluate him. But Olave and Wilson are legit, like clear in the NFL superstar receivers. Chase and Jefferson, clear superstar NFL receivers. Even the Alabama group, right? Judy's had his issues. Waddle's clearly a superstar. Devontae Smith won the Heisman. He's clearly a superstar. Henry Ruggs, well, we know he can go fast. But otherwise, it just, I don't see guys quite on that level. If you're Ohio State, yes, they're very good. I don't think they're as good as what you had a year or two ago. I think it's kind of holding everything back. And what we saw in that Georgia game, to me, more than anything, is that Tennessee's receivers, Hyatt got a little dinged up in that game and then just kind of disappeared. But I think Hyatt just kind of sneakily is a 4.2, 4.3 guy. And he was blowing up for 150 plus yards. I don't know how many games in a row. And Georgia just clearly said, we are not going to let Hyatt beat us, especially over the top. And they dared Tennessee to run that offense through everybody else. Tillman had a pretty good day. Brew McCoy has never really shown up a ton for them. And Tennessee could not move the ball consistently without Hyatt. And to me, that just goes back to the fact that I think wide receivers are the thing that drives this new RPO era of football. And I think this is maybe a little bit of a down period relative to the just insane talent we had for about 3 years. And it's really slowed down these elite offenses. So long rant there, but yeah.
No, I think it's a fair one. I do want to do a top 10 tonight, but I want to get in a little bit a discussion of TCU. I will say that the final score was there for a minute. TCU was blowing out Tech, and then Tech scored late to make it a 10-point spread, I think, or something like that. But also TCU was in jeopardy of going trailing in the fourth quarter at some point. So it was a really weird game. I mean, they're undefeated, right? And so Clemson lost. Tennessee lost, probably still going to stay ahead of TCU. Alabama lost. They're out of the top 10. I don't know that you can't move a 2-loss LSU above them. How legit is TCU and how much of a product of their opponents faced are they at this point?
Yeah, I like how you gave me this question. Yeah. It's tough. I mean, when you go back, go back and look down their list of opponents, right? What are their big wins? Their big wins were Oklahoma, with Gabriel got hurt, which we saw what that team was like without Gabriel. Then they beat Kansas by 7. Then they beat Oklahoma State by 3. Then they beat Kansas State by 10. They just beat Texas Tech by 10. West Virginia by 10. I mean, there's something to be said for the just keep winning, just keep swimming. And I think you have to give credit to that for being undefeated. If TCU was in the Big Ten or the SEC, I would be very surprised if they had fewer than 3 losses with a decently hard schedule. That's just my gut. And I know there's probably somebody going to explode on me for that, but I've watched a lot of the Big 12 teams, and quite frankly, I just don't. I'm not very high on the Big 12 this year, and I know it's kind of funny, right? Like people want to bash the ACC, but what evidence do we really have that the ACC is worse than like the Big 12? I mean, the fact that the ACC struggles against each other, what does that really mean? Pitt took Tennessee to overtime. I guess you can point to the fact that Notre Dame just beat up on Clemson, and that says a lot. But Clemson really wasn't in any way dominant this year in the ACC. And I think the Big 12 has higher scores, more interesting stakes. Things have gone back and forth a lot. But if you want to talk external data points, the best data point is what? I mean, is it the fact that Texas kind of got close to beating Alabama when Alabama was in a funk? Because we've seen this a few times now, and it seems like Alabama does just get in funks and plays bad football. And so I think TCU, to some degree, has just been sort of the beneficiary of doing that. It's also worth noting they still have to play Texas, Baylor, and Iowa State. I think it's more likely than not that they do drop one of those games. But all that said, I'm going to have to rank them high because they are undefeated. No one else is. So that's my honest opinion on it. I'm kind of curious to hear yours, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, mine's going to roll into it's going to roll into a top. And this one's pretty hard.
We do have a lot of super chats to cover, and I don't want to ignore them. So I appreciate everybody that sent them. I want to run through those at some point, but yeah.
Okay. Let's do a couple of those while I figure out my last two. Why don't we do?
Okay, sure. So I'll start from the top. The Georgia game. Matt Menino said, "Hey nerds, big fan. What does the Tennessee Georgia game tell you about Georgia's defensive turnover from last year to this year?" I don't think Georgia's as good defensively as they were last year. They played really good football in that game. They rushed the passer a lot better than most of us were expecting. There were times when they got beat a little bit, but it's clear that playing at home is an advantage. And Tennessee, They just outcoached Tennessee more than anything. I think they had a scheme that was prepared for Tennessee. They played with a high motor. They were well prepared for that game. If last year's personnel played with that motivation and that scheme, I think they destroy Tennessee. Like that game ends up being 40-10. I think the turnover in personnel is a reason why that game never completely got out of hand from a score perspective. But Georgia is still playing probably more consistent or efficient than anyone else. Jermaine Jones said Georgia will go back-to-back without elite wide receiver play. I think that may be true to a certain extent, but that guy Arian Smith that got hurt at one point this year and came back, big factor in that game for Georgia. Georgia is the one team that's really winning off the run game. They have exceptionally efficient passing from Stetson Bennett. He's I think he got banged up or something, and he wasn't throwing the ball very efficiently, and he's gotten back to that. And when they're in that mode, they're kind of unstoppable. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's an argument for that, but I also, I'll note when they played Alabama, who had 2 elite receivers, they got torched the first time. I don't know. I'm not sure that they're not in this position somewhat by default because they haven't had to play some of the elite receivers, and that's maybe a little bit of a nod to what Ohio State could potentially do. Couple more. Michigan, we didn't talk on that game a ton. David Bonham said, Michigan looked horrible, praying we were using this game to work on things. JJ needs to hit open guys downfield. Great show, boys, go blue. I've taken a lot of crap over the course of the year for saying that I'm not that high on JJ McCarthy. I think when you see guys that are inconsistent passing, we start to make assumptions about how they're going to fix their mechanics or suddenly become better. That's something that if it does happen, it usually takes a couple years, not like half a season. It's one thing to be inconsistent or look like you're unsteady, sort of deer in the headlights mode. That's not McCarthy's problem. And so I don't think these problems are going to go away, at least not this year. Maybe not ever. I think that is who McCarthy is, and they're going to have to build around him. But again, they can build an offense that is a run-based offense that wears on you and they put teams away just like they did today. And I think that is an avenue to a significant amount of success. Just maybe not the success they want. Carew Wilson said, how many points do you think home field means in college football? Do you think it decided the LSU game? That the team up north is at Ohio State will make a difference. This gets into a lot of statistical odds-making sort of concepts that I talk about sometimes, that we make this mistake of saying that on average, home field advantage seems to make a 3-point difference. There's regressions that show that. I know Parker at Stats of War made that point. I think the error is to think that it means 3 points every time, because these big games against high-level teams where the crowd is super motivated, I think those home crowds mean a lot more. When it's, if it's Ole Miss playing Kentucky and neither team really cares, I don't know that home field advantage is worth more than a few points. When you have these games like Tennessee going to Georgia and they're number 1, it is clearly very hard to play as a top 5 team on the road. Crowds are going bonkers. Players, I think, still aren't completely used to playing on the road. Everybody still looks a little bit like freshmen at times. A lot of these guys still never, because of last year's rotation, haven't really played in either any hostile environments or not very many, depending on how last year's schedule worked out, and they're struggling a lot more. So I think in those games, it can be, honestly, I think it can be like a 10-point advantage. Javari Williams just said in the Michigan game, and I'm just trying to run through it here, give me Michigan versus any of these struggle bus blue blood world beaters. And I just saw Mississippi State just did the classic run up the gut and score a touchdown to put the game away, I think. We've won all our games. Sure, not every one of them look pretty, but have ended up lopsided on the scoreboard. Those other guys are keeping it close. I think that's true, but I got to be honest. The schedule for Michigan hasn't been that great. I mean, putting away Rutgers is not a huge accomplishment. You did play Iowa early in the year. You haven't necessarily looked like world beaters yourself when you played teams of actual top 20-ish quality. And that's going to be a little bit of the problem for Michigan against Ohio State. It's kind of hard to judge how they're going to do against a team that is just way more capable than anyone else they've played. Daniel, do you want to run with the top 10? You want me to cover? We've got like 6 more, so I'm happy to keep going through these.
Yeah. Let me break it up a little bit and hit a top 10, and we can go from there. So this is hard, and I'm just gonna put that caveat out there. I'm gonna make some people mad, but I do it every week, and I'm okay with that. I've got Georgia number 1. I think that's pretty clear. They've got the best resume, and they've been dominant. They've now beaten 2 top 6 teams in dominant fashion. And so I think that also what we saw today sort of confirms that maybe the Oregon game wasn't a fluke, because we've all been trying to explain away that Oregon game was a fluke, but it just happened that Georgia went into SEC play, not tough SEC games, but went into SEC play, and Oregon went into play like they played Colorado today. Like they've played poor teams. They had to claw and fight from behind to beat Washington State. So I think that Oregon's look better. I've heard a lot of Bo Nix Heisman chatter and not the meme that's going around. That's a little off to me, but I've got Ohio State number 2 and Michigan number 3. This is really close. The thing that concerns me about Michigan is against Rutgers today. I think J.J. McCarthy had like 5.6 yards per attempt, and there might have been some wind and some weather there too. But he is who he is. 5.6. And my concern with Michigan is what happens when they don't hit a couple of 60-yard runs in a game. If a team can force them to run an offense, but I've got kind of the opposite concerns with Ohio State, Josh, and I've got them too, but I don't want to kill them for a ridiculous weather game against Northwestern, but Northwestern's 1-8. At some point, you've got to be able to have an offensive line that can take over and run the ball enough that it opens up short passing game for you that doesn't get impacted as much by the wind. The vertical game, I get it, but Ohio State couldn't control that game in the line of scrimmage and offense that's actually pretty putrid. I'm dropping Tennessee to number 4 ahead of TCU for exactly what you said earlier. I think Tennessee is a better team than TCU. I also saw something today that I think TCU has been trailing in the second half 4 times this year, and they've played injured quarterbacks in almost all of their games, played against injured quarterbacks in almost all their games. So I think that's telling. What will really be telling for all the people that are coming at me right now for not having TCU higher, because remember, this is kind of a combination power ranking too. We don't just rank like the AP. It'll be telling to see what current number 24 Texas is hosting TCU next week, what that point spread is. Because if that point spread is kind of tight, then that probably tells you that TCU, Vegas doesn't think that they're the 3rd or 4th best team in the country. I've got Oregon at number 6. The one thing I like about Oregon, even though I think they've played a bunch of below average teams, is Oregon's handling their business. Other than that Washington State game, they're killing people, and that's something that USC is not doing, and that's why USC is further down my list. I've got LSU at number 7. They won that game today. I'm maybe a little more impressed with how bad they beat Ole Miss, but it's hard to ignore LSU at this point, and this is one where I do think that like bunch of transfers, new coaching staff, new quarterback explains why they lost to Florida State. I don't think anybody would pick Florida State on a neutral field if they played today. I've got USC number 8, and they're playing right now. It's 13-7 over Cal. I hope they beat Cal. Just so my top 10 doesn't look bad. And this is where everybody gets mad at me, Josh, and I don't care. It's my show. I can do what I want. I've got Alabama at number 9, and everybody's going to call me an SEC homer. But what I want people to do is look at what's beyond the top 10 right now, because you got to move somebody up. Are we moving Ole Miss up ahead of Alabama because Ole Miss has one fewer loss, hasn't played Tennessee, that beat LSU 40-13 right after losing by 3 touchdowns last week or 2 weeks ago? This LSU team that went to overtime with Alabama at home beat Ole Miss by 3 touchdowns. So to me, when I'm looking at these two teams, there's no way that I think Ole Miss is better than Alabama. Now, Ole Miss might beat Alabama in a couple weeks or next week or whatever, but looking at what they've played throughout the year, Alabama's played 2 top 10 teams on the road, right? And that's a huge issue. I would argue that if Alabama got those two teams at home, they'd be undefeated right now, but they'd be a little bit like TCU in my mind. Like, I think they'd be a little bit of fool's gold at number 1. And so I got Alabama number 9. I don't think they're a great team, but Kansas State just lost at home to a team Alabama beat on the road, right? So we can't move them up, right? I've got UCLA number 10. This is one that maybe you could put ahead of Alabama. They did lose a couple weeks ago, but they handled their business last week. They've got a clean record. And honestly, I just don't know who else to put there. Utah, who lost to Florida, Penn State 6-2, maybe 7-2 now. Illinois lost today to Michigan State. I just don't know what to do, Josh. Then like everything in my mind says that Alabama is not a top 10 team because of the issues they have with scheme, because I think they have issues at quarterback, but I just don't know who else to put there. And the performances that Alabama's put together their losses don't get any closer. People keep talking about they're a few plays away from being 4-3 a couple weeks ago. They're 2 plays away from being undefeated. And I don't think they would be the best team in the country, but I think that matters for something if we're looking at the rest of the field. So for those of you that get at me in the comments, tell me who you would put ahead of Alabama at that 9th or 10th slot, because everybody lost today. And with that, Josh, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah. Unsurprisingly, a lot of the same thoughts and comments. I mean, my number 1 team is Georgia. I think they have to be number 1 after beating Tennessee today. They've had a couple slow games, but those Kent State, Missouri games were kind of weird games where they turn the ball over, yada, yada. I'm not really necessarily making excuses for them other than the fact that a lot of teams have had slow games. And at least with theirs, you can say, yeah, well, if they didn't turn the ball over, it wouldn't have been close. You can say that with some confidence, really. And when they've put stuff together, and they kind of have most weeks this year, they've been dominant. And to control Tennessee is the most impressive win I think anybody has to this point. Tennessee's beating Alabama was the most impressive, but that's really, I think, fallen by the wayside in a number of different ways. So you've got to tip your hat to Georgia. My number 2 is Michigan, and my number 3 is Ohio State. Those two have to be there as the 2 undefeateds. And I'm going to go ahead and run through a bunch of super chats because the same concept is going to come up 100 times. Isaac Atkins says you can't take a stab at Stroud in that wind he played in. Uncle Rico says, are you seriously judging CJ Stroud in 30 to 50 mile per hour winds? Give me a break. Uptown Daniel says Ohio State won. We have a defense that wins now. That's what matters. But when you turn it around, Javari Williams said, I bet you guys $100 super chat we beat Ohio State. That's I think sort of a lot of stuff in a nutshell. Where a lot of people are at is people say, yeah, you can't judge Ohio State. We have the wind going on. We can't really throw the ball downfield. And I was the one that tweeted out earlier today. It's amazing what happens when your first read is consistently open. That Haynes King was at 10.2 yards per attempt to begin the game. It was Texas A&M, so they had to make sure they had a hard stop before they hit 25 points and then just stayed there for the rest of the ball game against Florida. But, Ohio State didn't have their first read open. They weren't playing Florida's defense. They were playing a defense that was playing quite well, and the wind was taking away the deep ball, so you couldn't leverage their athleticism. I get all that. But my point was, when that shot play isn't there, Ohio State didn't really have a counterpunch. And my thing with Michigan is they got some counterpunches. I mean, to Daniel's point, I'm a little worried about what Michigan is when they can't get these explosive runs. But what I do see for Michigan is when the game gets tough, Michigan can lean on you and grind on you, and they can pound the ball and they can run the ball well enough and get enough explosive plays that they can blow a game open like that. And defensively, they're pretty good and sound. I think Ohio State and Michigan are in similar in that regard. I don't know what it looks like when they play each other in a wide open game, in good weather. I can buy the argument that Ohio State could bomb away in Michigan. I can also buy the argument that Ohio State's offensive line hasn't always looked elite. They may get rendered one-dimensional, and the game could end up – I'm not saying it's going to get as lopsided as the game did, but, Michigan can win for a lot of the same reasons. Quaker Devil 08 had said apologies if already discussed, but do you see a scenario where Ohio State and Michigan both get in? Also, ignore some of the Homer Ohio State takes. And I would do agree with them. I think most Ohio State fans are reasonable, but yeah, I mean, there's very much a reality in play where Michigan and Ohio State could both get in, and it's very deserved. Those two teams are way head and shoulders better from a consistency standpoint than just about anyone else, including anyone in the Big Ten. My concern, and the thing that I keep espousing, is the Big Ten has so many teams that are so limited in one way or another, particularly the ability to throw the ball deep. It makes evaluating Ohio State and Michigan hard. It does not mean that Ohio State and Michigan can't defend the deep pass. It just means I don't really know. And that answer is a big part of how I'd want to rank them 2 and 3. And beyond that, it's really subjective. It gets a little more interesting / difficult from this point on. I have Tennessee number 4 ahead of TCU at number 5. Sort of the same concept. I think Tennessee's offense is as good or better than TCU's. I have watched TCU a lot. Their defense is not good. No. It's not good. Texas Tech had plays against busted coverage where they're running wide open down the field. Texas Tech is a scrappy team that's given a lot of people problems this year. They're not a great team. And TCU, we were talking about it earlier in our show, is consistently winning these games by like 10 points. They're never really in command. I think they're kind of been the beneficiary of playing what is not an overly tough schedule without having played Texas yet, without having played Baylor yet. They played a lot of teams with backup, with dinged up quarterbacks or injury situations. I'm not a huge fan of TCU, but they're undefeated. And the way we do our top 10 is to say, how did you do against your schedule, and how would the team behind you have done with the same schedule, or vice versa, right? How would you have done with their schedule? I don't think TCU is undefeated in the Big Ten or SEC. In fact, I think they have multiple losses in those conferences, just from my view of having watched them. I do give them credit because they've been able to win consistently, which is not something everyone's done, but they haven't looked pretty in doing it. They just have played a lot of teams where you could get away with it. And that's kind of how I just try to parse it mentally, because it's the only way you can do it. My number 6 team is Oregon. Oregon continues to look pretty good. They've played good football. They really ran away with the game today, again, against a bad opponent, but still, I think you can chalk up some of that week 1 game to be week 1 jitters, new coaching staff. But I also, in the back of my mind, go, you know what? I've seen Bo Nix against Georgia enough times to see him look like that a lot. And I think there may be something there to the fact that may just be where the gap is between the Pac-12 and some of these other major conferences, or at least the elite teams in those conferences. And so I'm kind of skittish on Oregon, but they've been good enough and consistent enough. There's no way I can put them really any lower than 6 in this field. Southern Cal is 7. Same discussion. Losing to Utah in a game where they very easily could have won that game. Kind of a weird end too. That's not great, given that Utah lost to Florida. I think Utah is a slightly better team than Florida. I think they're a better team than Florida, win that more often than not. But Florida's a bad team and has been a bad team in the SEC. So losing that game is not good. But I also don't know what USC's really accomplished to this point in the year to really warrant it. But again, you got 1 loss, and I can't really drop you too much for that. They're playing right now. They're up on Cal. If they lose that game, so be it. That happened when they lost to Utah. But, that just is what it is. You can slot somebody else up in the 10th slot, and they would fall out of the top 10 if they lost another game. My number 8 is LSU. They have 2 losses, and I can't put them a whole lot higher than that. They have been, for the past several weeks, one of the best teams in college football. I talked about earlier that Tennessee game was a bit, you can point to it being a bit of a fluke, because they lost their left tackle to illness the morning of the game. They lost their left guard, I think, right around the end of the first quarter. And their offensive line collapsed, and Tennessee blew them out because the offense they were absolutely hemorrhaging penetration on every play. And that meant they kept giving the ball back to Tennessee, and everything just sort of started piling up on LSU. Other than that game, though, they've looked really good. Blowing out Ole Miss is probably a pretty big deal. Beating Alabama is a pretty big deal. That is a very good LSU team. This is where I have the same problem that Daniel has. My number 9 is Alabama, because you can rag on them all you want, talk about how bad they are. They lost to a legit top 10 team, and they lost to a legit top 5 team.
On the last play of the game for both of them.
The last play of the game for both of them.
On the road.
And if you want to look at who's left in this list and tell me who you want to put higher, I mean, maybe UCLA. It's tough. I can't really put Ole Miss ahead of them, given where Ole Miss is at. And everybody else that you want to list probably has 2 losses. So you've got to, I think Alabama is the best 2-loss team, and the best 2-loss team probably going to end up number 9. And number 10 is tough. And this is sort of an example of it. My number 10 right now was Clemson. I don't think Clemson's a great team. They've got one loss. I think they've won a lot of games against teams like Wake Forest that aren't that great in close games, the end of regulation. I do think the ACC may be a little better than we want to give them credit for. But, if Clemson was to play UCLA on a neutral field, who would I pick to win? If UCLA played Clemson's schedule, would I think they only had one loss? I kind of think Clemson would do better if they traded schedule. So I've got them 10. And you're going to have a lot of people are going to disagree with that. But to Daniel's point, you've got to write out a top 10 and realize the fall off, as often happens, particularly in resume, from about number 6 on, is steep. And the pickings, we started about having this big group from like number 4 to number 25. That group's kind of expanded due to things like LSU winning this game against Alabama up to about 8 teams. And now the group behind them all have major warts. So, yeah, I have Alabama 9, Clemson 10. And I'll note, I don't want to go off on a rant because we do it enough, but I want to note, this is why I don't want a 12-team playoff.
Right.
Because Alabama should not be in the playoff.
Right.
With who they are. If you make this a 12-team playoff, Alabama and Clemson 100% are going to end up in the playoff.
Alabama's not going to win their division. They're not going to win their division. And it's not one of those like, oh, you lost to 2019 LSU and you have one loss and the other East sucks. No, they're not going to win their division comfortably. There are going to be 3 teams ranked higher than them in the SEC, and they would still make the playoffs, and this game would have such little impact. Josh, you got to comment on this because there's a couple of Penn State fans getting at me that Penn State should be ranked ahead of Alabama. And they said that Penn State's losses are worse and they've had a better season. But Penn State, yeah, they lost to higher ranked teams. They got blown out in both of them. They were close towards the end with Ohio State, 44-31, 41-17 at Michigan. As Michigan fans told us, wasn't even a competition. They're worse at quarterback than Alabama. And they also beat Purdue by 4 on the road, to open the season. They had a 17-7 game against Northwestern. I don't know what their good win is either. Again, Alabama has lost two top 10 teams on the road.
And you can say good win. You take it a step further. What is their best game? Is it blowing out Auburn? Was that even a big deal? Like, I don't know that it really is because Auburn's probably not going to make a bowl. What's the next best win? I guess blowing out Minnesota, who's not a great team. And you can start to say, well, Alabama's not that great either. Look, Mississippi State and Texas are better than anyone Penn State's beaten. And you can say those 2 teams aren't that good. Texas is probably considerably better than anyone Penn State's beaten. And I'm not saying Texas is that great, but they're going to be ranked and they legitimately should be ranked. Penn State, this is kind of my problem again with the Big Ten, which is probably going to make a lot of Big Ten fans mad, but it's not a shot on Michigan and it's not a shot on Ohio State because they've won consistently and they've had off games, which we've sort of talked about. But they clearly have been a better team than the others. Even they're a better team having an off game, right? But when you look at the rest of that conference, I don't really know who to point to say, yeah, that's a team that's impressive to have beaten because it's one thing to talk about like everybody beats itself up. We talk all the time about the fact that a conference has to go 500 against itself, right? Mathematically, every conference is going to average a 500 record. You have to because, somebody wins and loses every game. It's just the way math works. But when I actually just sit and watch Big Ten football, which I do a lot, like Wisconsin's offense and just overall team is bad. Purdue is not a good football team. Northwestern's offense is horrible, and their defense isn't even really that good. They can play well when everything's in front of them, but they're not very athletic. Minnesota is very sporadic. Indiana is a bad team that's had some like serious slip-ups across the board. Like what Michigan State – yeah, it's hard to really rack up any good wins. And I think Penn State may well end the year with 2 losses, but they're going to do it because, the Big Ten is top heavy. They are what people like to accuse the SEC of being a lot of times. I'm sure everybody's now spamming that I'm SEC homer, and I'm not. I have two of those teams, number 2, number 3, maybe you want to argue they should be over Georgia. I don't think many people are, given that Georgia's actually just beat the team that was number 1. Ohio State and Michigan don't have anything remotely like that on their resume right now. It's just super top heavy, and I don't know how good the rest of the Big Ten really is. And so, yeah, it's the TCU problem all over again. When you have the rest of the schedule like that, you can kind of run through with 2 or 3 losses. And for all that people want to ding Alabama, playing Texas, playing Mississippi State, playing Tennessee, playing LSU, they're going to play Ole Miss. They've got a lot of games that are quality games you could lose, quality teams you could lose to, that have pretty good teams on both sides of the ball. All those teams can play offense at a decent level. All those teams can play defense at a decent level. And I don't know that anybody else has a schedule like that. And so that's, comparing Penn State to Alabama, I think it's pretty silly.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, it's weird how people say something that's ridiculous or even up for debate. Like, and then we take a side of the debate that most people would agree with, and then we're called homers for it. I don't think even what we saw tonight with Alabama, like, everybody after Alabama missed a field goal to beat Tennessee on the road, everybody's like, oh, Alabama's trash. I think Alabama's got issues this year, but Penn State has issues too. And that's my thing, is like, all these people calling us homers, if there was a gun to their head, Alabama, Penn State on a neutral field, they're not picking Penn State. And that's okay. But we got to get to some super chats, Josh. I got about 10 more minutes before I have to go to sleep. Ace Man, I love that Ace Man shows up, win, lose, or draw for his A&M team. How about them Texas Aggies scoring 24.5? Never mind the team missing 31 players, including 12 of 22 starters in the second half. Josh, I was surprised. I was surprised at the offensive efficiency. I was surprised that it was done with King at the helm. I want to remind everyone that Florida, for whatever reason, has one of the worst defenses in the country, and that's including G5s. Like, they're in the like 100 teens, which is wild to me. But they are, for whatever reason. But we made that parity, the Iowa Texas A&M parity, and both of those teams put up some points today. So for that, they get some credit. And Ace Man, I hope you see a little bit of glimmer of from that.
Yeah, when Haynes King is on rhythm and throwing, he can look like a pretty good quarterback. This is the first game where I've seen why Texas A&M started him to start the year. When everything was going pretty well, he looks pretty good. He's athletic. He can really drive a football. They found a couple receivers now in Stewart and Moose Muhammad. They can move the ball pretty well. But once King started getting hit, it's like the offense just started to fall apart. And all they have at that point is sort of toss the ball up to Stewart, and A-Chain, who's a very good player, just hand the ball to him as much as possible, and you can't be that overly reliant on him. But yeah, to your point, you got to be real, right? Florida was blown out by Georgia. They lost by 10 to LSU. They beat Missouri by a touchdown. They beat South Florida by 3. They lost to Kentucky by 10. It's not just that they're a 4-4 team. They're a 4-4 team that wasn't particularly close to beating the teams better than them. The biggest win they had was the Utah game, which that game really, just because it was week 1, and I know there's a lot of week 1 jitters and stuff, that should bother you that Florida beat Utah, because there's not enough data points between conferences to ignore that kind of thing. It should bother you. But yeah, I am with you. I think Florida's not great. And when things got going, the lack of depth definitely showed on the defensive side of the ball for A&M in the second half. I know we got to get through a lot of super chats. So
yeah, Sergeant Sharkey says, "I know I've been rough on you guys lately. Still love you all." Hey, this is like, we're all family here, especially on the live show. Like, we get a lot of different passersby on our previews because they're team specific, and people will see that because of the Google algorithm. The live show is for family. We have our scraps in the comments. I've blocked a couple of people tonight, including Sean Dooley. Y'all can say thank you in the chat for me blocking that guy. But I love it when people are rough on us, because as long as they don't take it personally when we give and take, it makes this whole thing interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, it does. And I'll give a shout out right now. I got over 750 people watching. I think that's the highest number we've ever had. on a live show.
We hit 862 tonight at one point.
Oh, wow. Yeah. So that's a big number. And we do this, the super chats are great and it helps us keep us going. But genuinely, we do this because we like interacting with you guys. We watch as much football as we can over the course of the day. We like talking about it. It's something we feel like we can do on the fly. Guys, it's tough to sit here and talk about 10 different teams and 10 different games. I'm watching 5 games at a time. You can't pay 100% attention doing that. It's not like I have any time to rewatch anything. But we love the interaction and we just love talking college football. We'd be talking about all the different games ourselves otherwise. So we might as well do one live. I'll take the next super chat and sort of turn it around to you. Scott R. This is about LSU. Scott R. Hefner said, "I'm an absolute homer, but the LSU backs and receivers were relentless. Not as talented as Jefferson and Chase, but they fought for the ball on extra yards." And I'll turn it to tie in another super chat from David Salinas. He says, "Georgia, Tennessee for the Natty after Michigan and Ohio State beat each other out. Opinions on if LSU wins the SEC championship game?" And first off, obviously one of Ohio State and Michigan has to lose because that's the way games work. Obviously, Tennessee, Georgia, and LSU, only one of them can really Georgia and LSU, if they win out on their divisions, only one of them can really win out. So what are your thoughts on that? LSU with where they're at, the receiving core versus Georgia. And do you think LSU has a chance to beat Georgia, number one? And number two, let me ask you the more difficult question. If LSU beats Georgia and you've got Ohio State beating Michigan, what the heck are you doing to seed for the playoff at that point? If let's say you got one loss Georgia who just lost to LSU, one loss Tennessee who only lost to Georgia, 2 loss LSU who actually won the SEC, and then Ohio State, let's say, Ohio State and Michigan, one of them undefeated, one loss. How in the world are you going to navigate that quagmire?
It's an interesting hypothetical. I don't think it's going to happen. I think the matchup, there are some elite teams that LSU could beat, like Alabama, on a neutral field against Georgia. This is a terrible matchup for LSU. The way they get their points, the way they get their yards. Like, again, we in our minds, Jaden Daniels had a great game, right? He was 5.7 yards per attempt. You've got to be a vertical passing threat, deep ball quarterback to beat Georgia. You got to beat Tennessee, but with a defense, and I just don't see it. But if they did win, it's tough because you've got potentially Oregon winning out, which we have that first game sort of marker to go by, but they'd still be a one-loss Pac-12 champion. We got TCU who could win out. It generally works out all in the end. And like you always say, once you lose a game, it doesn't matter. Once you lose a game, you no longer control your own destiny. So you don't really get to complain if you don't make it in. But I also think in the back of my mind, Michigan canceling the UCLA series is going to stick with this committee, I think. So I think that Michigan, if they went out, they're fine. But a one-loss Michigan team who's going to have one good win, I'm assuming Penn State wins out, one good win in Penn State, and it's a really good win because they beat them soundly. And then the only top 10-ish team they played, they lost to in Ohio State. And we don't have that data point of seeing how they would do out of conference. I think that puts Michigan in a tight spot. But again, like I think that it's so hard to talk about those hypotheticals now because it always tends to work itself out. What if TCU loses this Saturday to Texas? Like, which I might pick Texas in that game. So who knows?
Yeah, there's a lot of variables. Somebody just asked, what are the odds that Oregon makes the playoff with a loss? And I was saying, right now it seems tough because you're going to have one of Ohio State, Michigan, maybe one loss. We could have that situation, right, where LSU wins the SEC, and then you're like, you feel like you need 3 or 4 teams in the Big Ten and SEC, which can't happen. But if TCU wins out, they're going to have to be in, and you start to run out of slots. But that's all assuming nobody else loses. And right now we're all assuming LSU wins the SEC West, which they probably do, but it's not guaranteed. Even that's not guaranteed, right? Like there's so many things that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
All these teams can lose. You just don't know. A couple more Mike Farino says, how's it going all? I have no clue how to evaluate anyone this year in the top 5. Appreciate it, Mike. Again, everybody shows up. I appreciate you guys that show up all the time. And yeah, I agree with you. It's the way you evaluate people in the top 5 this year is to say, yeah, you've got clearly more talent than other people, but you're not necessarily playing better than them on a weekly basis. That's just where we're at. And then another thing that's been a big conversation point in the chat, maybe this is a good thing to end on. So I'll sort of say further super chats I may not get to, just word of warning. Much Mango said, should Bryce Young opt out? That is actually, I think, kind of an interesting question because
yes,
I hate opting out. I think I hate opting out. I hate this idea that you need to shut down your season if you don't have a national title to play for. You know, you play football as a privilege, but it's also, you know, you're signed up to play for this football team, strap on a jersey, you get a full scholarship and all these benefits to do it. And the bargain there is you're going to finish out your season something, you know, absent something that happens to you personally or something catastrophic. But the first part of that is important, something that happens to you personally. And I know you said yes, Daniel. Well, let me ask you, why did you say yes?
Because I think for whatever reason, his performance has been so poor. His draft stock is tanked, which is costing him millions of dollars. And I think he can still, if he opts out now, he can blame it on the shoulder and leave some sort of plausible deniability and some sort of question and doubt. If he has another game like tonight or plays out this season, especially if other Alabama players start opting out, putting more pressure on him, he could see his draft stock really tank, like really, really tank. So I think that he could blame it on the shoulder. It might actually be the shoulder because he's not had a lot of zip on a lot of his throws. And then he's going to show out at the combine other than when they measure his height.
Yeah, I think I actually think there's a real argument for it, but I'll say the reason I'd say it is I don't think he's healthy enough to be very effective. What we saw today in that LSU game, I have, for however many years we've been doing the show, have a pretty good reputation of tearing down winners more than building up losers, or vice versa, right? But you know, teams do tend to lose in college more from mistakes than things you do right, absent like championship games. Bryce Young is not right as a passer. He's not healthy. He's not throwing the ball well. I feel like he has to have a shoulder issue. It's more apparent than a couple of years ago. I talked about, we were huge Stetson Bennett defenders from like day one. Okay. And in 2020, there was this point where he just became terrible and everyone hated him. And I kept saying over and over again, I think the dude's hurt. It was later admitted that he had a shoulder injury. The drop off in Bryce Young is significantly worse than that. I think Young must either he's not practicing at all and he's just way off, which is possible. But even if that's true, I think he has a pretty serious shoulder injury. I don't think he can throw the ball effectively. He can run the offense and make checks. And I know Alabama's probably pretty concerned because the backup quarterback that played against Texas A&M was a disaster. Bryce Young probably missed 10 throws tonight. Like, if they had B-level quarterback play, Alabama wins that game by 2 scores. And I know Bryce Young did some Heisman scrambling things. There were so many routine plays that he didn't hit. Like, he clearly wasn't in check and like on the right page in terms of doing his checkdowns and things. He was not reading blitzes and throwing hot reads where Jaden Daniels was all over that and was punishing Alabama for it the entire game. But so many throws at 10 plus yards were either uncatchable or in a very, very difficult position to be caught. I don't know how much you're even getting from Bryce Young other than his ability to sort of manage the offense. And if you have a young player that you think can play at a high level, you maybe need to start him. And maybe Bryce Young needs to just opt out and claim it's his shoulder. And Alabama needs to move on because they may just be in a situation where Bryce Young is not physically healthy enough to play well enough to play winning football for them at the level that they want to play at. And that's harsh, but I think that's the reality of it. The commentators were, I thought, really dancing around it, but talking about when you have a guy that's sort of out of rhythm and, well, he's not quite in sync and this is what you got to do. What they were all dancing around is that Bryce Young was playing very poorly. And I do think it's probably injury driven. It's probably driven a lot by a lack of practice time. But if that's what you're going to get out of him and you're Bryce Young and that's all you're going to be able to deliver, that's not good for the team. It's not good for him. And it's just, you need to shut it down for injury and get healthy. And I think that's maybe where he is.
The one caveat I will offer, and I got to go to bed after this, but what we've seen with Bryce Young with these Heisman moments is where he had to claw himself out of a game where he completely blanked and did nothing for 2 quarters and do some hero thing at the end. So Texas A&M last year, he did it. They ended up losing, but he did it. Auburn last year, 0 or 3 points going in the 4th quarter. So, yeah, he made a Heisman moment at the end, and it was cool, but he was bad. Game. Everybody's going to remember him slipping away and putting Alabama in field goal range to win that ball game, but he was bad. Most of that game, he was bad. And I know it's also scheme related, but yes, it might be his shoulder. But I also think that we've seen enough of these games. This is like the 4th game. LSU last year. So this is like the 4th game of his where he's disappeared for a half. I think some of it is injury related but just to preserve his draft stock, he might need to shut it down. Josh, I got to go to bed. I'm super tired, but I would love for you to give a parting shot before we wrap it up.
Yeah, I think my parting shot is that it's kind of funny, right? That we talk about how college football is wide open and then all these things can happen, and invariably it all shakes itself out. But it's also funny that, a few weeks ago, everybody was sort of trying to talk up the fact that Georgia was overrated. Nobody was discussing LSU. Alabama was the team right there at the top. Now all that's upside down. And again, it can change again. I just feel like, and I've said it several times, everybody wants 2007 zaniness football. And everybody forgets 2000 zaniness happens because a lot of teams lose, and teams lose because the elite teams look really bad multiple times a year. And that's kind of what we're getting. But I will say, from all that, I still very much feel like this is the opposite of what should cause you to expand college football. The fact that these losses matter only happens because you have a 14 playoff. If we go, and we will probably move to a 12-team playoff, this Alabama team is in anyway. And that just, frankly, it just ticks me off. Like, this Alabama team should not be in a playoff. After having lost the 2 meaningful games they had in a regular season, it won't matter, which means, yes, Alabama's preseason ranking virtually guarantees a playoff slot. No matter, not only do they not win the division, but they could lose the division by, they drop multiple games, be multiple games behind their division winner. Their division winner can go and lose to the SEC title. They could be the 4th best person in the SEC, 4th best team in the SEC, and go to the playoff. I don't like that reality. I think it's going to really, really devalue the regular season. This game would have tremendously less weight, and the whole regular season is basically just going to be twiddling our thumbs, watching the high talent teams just sort of plug along to the playoff. And yeah, for these other teams, everybody wants to say, oh, yeah, but that means sure Oregon gets a slot and TCU gets a slot. It's like, great. And they're going to end up seeded against that 2-loss Alabama team. And if they, if Oregon or TCU plays Alabama, they're going to be a multi-touchdown underdog. And they're probably going to lose by a large margin. And then Alabama's going to get a shot to erase everything that mattered in the regular season. And because we have all these automatic qualifiers, we don't even seed best to worst team in terms of quality. So you could be the 6th best team, the number 6 seed or the number 6 team in the seeding, and you might have an easier path than the number 5 team. So it really doesn't even flipping matter how many games you lose. Yeah. So that's going to be my parting shot.
Yeah, and Alabama will not play the conference championship game. They'll rest at home, and you get an Alabama team who has schemed and prepped and rested for a month in round 1 instead of us remembering this overtime win. We're going to remember this overtime win for LSU for a decade or more. We remember kick 6. We won't remember these things. The Eagles made the playoffs last year. They started the season 3-6. If the Eagles went on to win everything, did anybody going to remember the 6 losses that they had? Absolutely not. it's pretty shameful that we can't be honest about this. I want to keep a 2-loss Alabama team out of the playoffs too. Anyway, that's it for us. Thanks so much for staying up this late with us, and we hope that y'all will check out some previews this week. Y'all have a great rest of your weekend. Good night and God bless.